Yeah, good afternoon. If you can't hear me at the back, by the way, I'm aware that it's quite a big room, just wave or throw something or something. I'm sort of still slightly getting acclimatised, having spent half the morning sitting in Bristol Airport while my plane was sitting on the tarmac at Newcastle Airport. So excuse me if I'm not quite tuned in with what went on this morning, but it was fun to arrive amidst sort of slush and people throwing snowballs and all that, so it's much more exciting than it is down south, I can tell you. I think what I say hopefully follows on quite nicely from what Joe was talking about and the case studies and so on, because this is very much about my experience over the last 6 months or so in building applications with open source at a company in Somerset where I'm working. And I can say, just on the subject of costs, while I remember, I can say with confidence that before they used open source, they didn't spend a penny on GIS licensing, and they're still not spending a penny on GIS licensing. So I think there is another way of looking at it, which is that open source, as well as providing a viable alternative for people who are currently paying money for licenses, also means, and I think this is particularly the case for small organisations, it opens up opportunities which simply weren't there before. And so my interest really is the extent to which there are real opportunities, and of course there are costs. I mean, let's not pretend that licensing is the only cost, because clearly it isn't. We must remember that the human costs which are involved in all software implementation. But licensing costs are psychologically, I think, they can be a barrier, and if that barrier isn't there, then all of a sudden things are opened up. So, I work for Cranfield University, but actually I'm seconded, and I have been for the last 6 months or so, to a company in Somerset called Sustain, and our strapline is that we're a carbon reduction company, which essentially means that we do a lot of consultancy and advice and documentation on energy reduction for a number of customers, typically local authorities, housing associations, energy companies, people for whom reducing energy for themselves or for their customers is one of the things they have to do as part of running their business. My particular work is focused around housing associations, who represent quite a fair proportion of our customers. And our approach has been, for the reasons that I've been talking about, because of the absence of licensing costs, our approach has been to use open source. And so what we've been doing really in the last 6 months is to work from the premise that we're going to use open source and effectively find out whether it works or not, and test that hypothesis with the aim at the end of the day being able to provide some maps for our customers and to put their data in maps for them to use. So this is a case study. So it's not, don't take it necessarily as a blueprint, or this is how you should do it, or this is the best way possible. It's simply, hopefully, an honest assessment and an account of what we've done and what we came up against and how we feel it went. So just in case you're not familiar with housing associations, I guess most of you will have an idea, but they're diverse organisations, but they all do pretty much the same thing. I mean, they all provide housing for tenants, mostly. I mean, some of them are very specialised. Some of them are have different kinds of tenancy, but essentially that's what they're about, providing social housing. However, they are diverse because they vary enormously in size, and the vast majority of them are pretty small. Maybe they have 50, 100, 500 dwellings under their control. They may just have a few staff. But there are equally a relatively small number of large housing associations who employ lots of staff and who are comparable or bigger than many local authorities. So, just to give you an idea, this is a map of the housing associations around where I live. This one in Porter's Head, which is North Somerset housing, about 6,000 units. That's fairly typical of the kind of people that we deal with as a carbon reduction company. And we deal with them because they have targets for reducing their carbon. And the difficulty they have is that whether they have 60,000 or 6,000 or 600 units, they all have to do this. So that presents some problems for them, I think, because some of them simply don't have the staff, the expertise to really address that very easily. So, what we do for them is to analyse their housing stock. And we use our energy expertise. We have people that understand this stuff. We use specialist software. We feed their housing stock database into the software. We make all kinds of assumptions based on the age of their building, the built form, data we get from their energy reduction programs, their boiler database. And what we come up with is a bunch of figures on something called SAP, which some of you may be aware of as an energy rating. We come up with estimates of energy costs. So effectively we do a stock analysis to give them those ratings because they have targets which they have to meet in terms of reducing those ratings. Now, clearly in order to meet targets, you need to know where you are. So we start off with giving them the baseline data, and then we can feed in some assumptions and say, okay, if you went ahead and put in a boiler replacement program, it would have this impact on your SAT ratings. If you went ahead and did an insulation program, it would have that impact. So the core service we're providing, just to give you some context to the application I want to talk about, is how they can reduce their energy consumptions in their properties. So we're very much dealing with raw data here. We use the specialist software. It's called NHL Stock Assessor. We come out with access databases and tables and a bunch of data. And what we've been looking for is ways of making this data available in a more accessible form to the housing association staff. Because it's all very well to give them a spreadsheet, but as we all know, spreadsheets can be a nightmare to interpret, and what we want to do is try and pull some intelligence out of that and try to make it, put that data in a form that people can understand. So that's what we're aiming for. And we need to ask some questions in doing that. We need to do some thinking about what the users want to see, what sort of visualization they want. And also, when we're summarizing, in order to move up from the detail to the level at which they can take decisions, we need to ask them some questions about at what level it's appropriate to summarize that. So this is where we're getting into sort of geographical analysis. Do you want to see things by postcode? Do you want to see them by your own management areas? Do you want to see them by wards or output areas, or what's the appropriate level of geography? We also need to know about what other data is relevant. So here's a bunch of data, which is what we've done. Well, maybe that data is going to be more meaningful if we start to put it together with some other data that makes sense to you as well. So they may have their own internal data. They may be stuff that they can give us in terms of their development program, for example, or their re-roofing program, or whatever. There may be external data they might be interested in terms of, I don't know, data on index of multiple deprivation, or fuel poverty, or other social indicators. So in trying to extract maximum value from this data, we also need to ask some questions and sort of move outside the constraints of the data that we're looking at and see how other data is going to fit into the picture.